Yes, so greetings and welcome back to the channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Now, this topic here, I don't really like doing this video because I don't get a lot of views. Hopefully, this get a lot of views. I don't know if recently you've been watching the news and see what's going on with the Niger thing and France. So I have a video that is about 2 to 3 year old, somewhere around there, of the sister ambassador Chihombori Quao speaking on this topic. And please, if you would stay with me and watch the whole video to the end, so that you can listen properly to what she's saying and see how she's been speaking the most for the longest on this topic, on the abuse of France towards its West African former colonies or continued colonies. Yeah, so please stay tuned and watch to the end, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. And also, if you like this type of video, give us a like so that I could, since I'm not traveling at the moment, could do more of this type of video. Okay, enjoy.
The last hour, it's been confirmed that several planes are in the air en route to Niger to evacuate French and other European citizens. It follows last week's military coup and a worsening security situation on the ground. The US, Spain and Italy are also arranging rescue flights. The UK has told British nationals in Niger to register their location and stay indoors. On Sunday, the regional bloc, ECOWAS, issued an ultimatum to the coup leaders: restore democracy within 7 days or face what it called all necessary means. Well, Niger is part of Africa's Sahel region, which stretches from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Overnight, Burkina Faso, Mali and Guinea issued a joint statement saying any military intervention in Niger would be regarded as a declaration of war on them. France says it has no plans to withdraw around 1,000 of its soldiers based in Niger, where they are part of an international effort to fight Islamist militants.
The government of France still has a lot of control over a number of African nations, of their former colonies.
They have significant control over all of their former colonies, specifically 14 of them. Just to give you the highlights of what they did when they were giving the independence, so to speak, to their former colonies. They forced them to sign a document which they are calling the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. You have to understand, on one hand, they're saying we're giving you independence, which turned out to be mostly political independence, but that you also have to sign this document, which is titled the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. So you're going to be independent, but you have to agree to continue to be colonized. So two countries said absolutely not. We are not going to sign those that document.
Those two countries?
Mali and Guinea.
Okay.
And what the French did, they went into those two countries, took everything that they thought they had brought to those two economies, poured concrete into the sewage pipes, and completely devastating the two economies. This was done as a way of letting the other countries know that if you do not sign this document, this is the fate that awaits you.
How has that negatively impacted those African countries?
It has impacted them terribly, terribly, terribly. If you look at it, you give up your, the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization said those countries were expected to deposit 85% of their bank reserves back then with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. And should those countries wish to request some of those monies, because remember they were only left with 15% of their reserves, then they would have to submit a financial statement for the country, and if approved, they could only access up to 20% of whatever they had deposited the year before as a loan at commercial interest rates. The only difference now is the 85% deposits have now been lowered down to maybe between 50 and 60%. But the countries are still forced and required to deposit their bank reserves with the French Central Bank. So picture this situation. You are depositing all your monies with France. Should you need some of your money, you get it as a loan at commercial interest rates. So immediately you have a credit with France, but you begin to owe France. This has been going on and continues to this day. So combined, the 14 countries are giving to France cash, cold hard cash, over $500 billion every year. And France takes that money and invests it in its own stock market under the French name, and the countries may or may not know the returns. Currently, for every 14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it in the French stock market, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion. So you do the math to see how much money France is taking out of Africa every year. And yet France has the audacity to then look at African countries and call them poor countries. Why would poor African countries give $500 billion to France year in and year out? What really gets me the most is, how does the world sit back and watch this carnage take place in Africa? Where is the United Nations? This is the body that's supposed to be looking out for any violations of human rights. It is my humble opinion that singularly, what France is doing to Africa is the biggest violation of human rights. Women and children are dying of starvation, youth unemployment, when the same poor countries are giving $500 billion to France. It simply does not make any sense. And I don't know how the world can sit back and watch all this unfold and nobody is saying anything. It's unacceptable. It is November 1884 to February of 1885.
Got it.
They met and chopped up Africa into the tiny little economies that we see today. Economies that clearly cannot survive on their own. Economies that are easy to destabilize should they begin to look like they're having a leg up. Economies that will make it very difficult for these countries to trade with each other. You see, economic development is increased productivity from one production cycle to the other. If you interfere with the ability of countries to trade, you immediately mess with economic development. So that partitioning of Africa back in 1884, and those partitionings remain in place today, is responsible for a lot of what has happened in Africa. Our inability to grow our economies, our inability to travel from one country to the other. You look at tourism. If you need to go to Africa and visit 3 different countries, you got to send your passport to DC 3 different times. And each time your passport comes back, you got to send it again to another country, 2, 3, 4 weeks before you get your passport back. And then you got to send it back to Washington. At times, those embassies are on the same street. You could have walked from one embassy to the other, but you can't do it. And by the time you get your passport back with the 3rd visa, the visa for the first country is expired. Who needs to go through all that? So you say, forget it, I'm not going to Africa, I'm going to Europe. At every level, what we see happening today in Africa that affects economic development is directly related to what was done in 1884. You try to go from one part of Africa to the other. It's easier to fly into Europe and then come back down. Why? A lot of the airspaces were closed. All of it, thanks to the Berlin Conference. So people don't realize that that decision has everlasting implications on what goes on in Africa, and at the end of the day, it crystallizes down to our failure to grow our economies because it is very expensive to do business from one country to the other.
So this map, what I see is, I don't see as many countries as we see today. So we see Henry, go to my iPad, please. Here's a map of Africa before the Berlin Conference.
Correct. So what we were prior to the Berlin Conference were massive, powerful kingdoms. Kingdoms with well-established religious and educational systems. Kingdoms that preceded the Greek civilization, the Roman Empire. If the truth be told, civilization began in Africa. Have you ever wondered why? When they talk about Greek philosophers, the mathematicians, they were sent to Egypt for training, for advancement. It's because Africa already had it. The pyramids, the Zimbabwe ruins, they were there over 2,500 years before the Greek civilization, 2,500 years before the Roman Empire. It all started in Africa. That's part of the history that was cut out, and they set out to get us to forget that life as we know it began in Africa. Civilization as we know it began in Africa. The Europeans stole it from us.
Explain the difference between the AU and the AUC.
The African Union is the membership of all the 55 African heads of states. The African Union Commission is the working organ of the African Union. So the African Union has a president who's always another head of state, and that membership is for 1 year. The working organ of the African Union is the African Union Commission, and it also has a chairperson. That term is 4 years, and that's who Chairman Musa Faki Mahamat is.
Jason.
So, you know, I wanted to ask a question, and if you knew, I have a friend who's from the Comoros Islands, and he was telling me about the difference between some of the other islands, and in particular, one island that's under French control called Mayotte. I was wondering if you could expand on that and tell me a little bit about.
Well, basically, it's like when you go to the Caribbean. You can even go to St. Martin. You have one part which is Dutch and the other part which is French. They just chopped up these islands and these countries arbitrarily. It depends on who wanted what. You take, for example, part of the Kilimanjaro was supposed to all be in Tanzania, but I think it was one of the queens, the English queens was visiting, and the story goes that the granddaughter says, "Oh, but grandma, I like that mountain." And so the grandma just said, "Okay, no problem. Let's just move the border a little bit into Tanzania so my granddaughter can have part of Mount Kilimanjaro." It was so very random, depending on who felt what. You look at how the DRC dips into Zambia in a very funny way. It's because Leopold decided he wanted a little bit more of the copper in Zambia, so he just carved it out the way he wanted it. It was all very arbitrary, and if you had a voice and the ability to do so and say, "This is what I want," okay, no problem, we put the border here.
You mentioned earlier how you don't understand how the UN or any other global humanitarian entity has not interfered and, you know, acted on behalf of AU, AUC, et cetera. I have that same concern now that I'm listening to you. But has there been a process? Is there a process to act against France legally regarding the UN, The Hague, anything? Because this, to me, seems like a clear violation of humanitarian laws, especially your recollection of them dumping concrete into sewers.
It is a serious violation against humanity. Well, let me say, over the years, we have had some heads of states who have tried to pull out of the pact for the continuation of colonization. Sadly, there were coups in those countries, and they found their heads, you know, simply put on the chopping block. They were assassinated. So the realities and the fear that countries might have are real because of the consequences from France should they decide to pull out. So there really hasn't been. Lately, we heard about the Vice Prime Minister of Italy. They were sick and tired of the young African youth crossing the Mediterranean and ending up on the southern borders. And so they challenged France and said, "Listen, next time we receive these refugees, we are going to bring them to France because you are the one who's taking all those funds out of Africa. That's why African economies cannot develop themselves because of what France is doing in Africa." So, but there hasn't been a coordinated effort to really say, France, enough is enough. You have got to stop this. And I think, as a black woman, as a mother, I'm at a point where I've had enough. And something needs to be done.
What would that take for a coordinated effort?
If all of Africa could come together, if the entire continent could come together. But our reality is, because of the stronghold that France has on Africa, France can destabilize any of its former colonies with the push of a button. So the reality is, trying to push back against France is mission impossible at this time, which is why we are very pleased that finally the African heads of states were able to come together and agreed on what we are calling the African Continental Free Trade Area. You got to understand, back in 1963, when our Pan-African leaders came together and created the Organization of African Unity, they were trying to undo the damage done by the Berlin Conference. But unfortunately, when they went to Addis Ababa, they were divided. We had the Casablanca group, who were Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. They were outnumbered by the others, who were the nationalists, who said, "Let's go slow." The Casablanca group, who said, "Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad, African Union now." Had we won, had the Casablanca group won in 1963, Africa would be in a very different place because all these borders would have been eliminated back then. They came up with a compromise, which we are calling Organization of African Unity. Year in, year out, for 55 years, the African heads of states met. The issue of an Africa speaking with one voice, one continent, one Africa was tabled, and year in and year out, we failed to reach consensus until last year, March 2018, when they finally agreed that enough is enough. Africa must speak with one voice. Africa must enter the world stage as one customs union, as one continent, speaking with one voice. That is the only way that Africa can begin to take her rightful place on the world stage. So it's been a lengthy process thanks to the legacy of colonization. It seems to me that this should have been a slam dunk. It's common sense. But because of interferences from former colonizers that just kept getting in the way. You look, for example, now West Africa is trying to have the West African echo and have one currency for West Africa. Even that process, it has taken decades because they keep getting interference from outside. So yes, efforts have been made, but not in a coordinated way because of influences and interruptions, interference from the outside.
Ambassador, may I ask another question? And that is about Kwame Nkrumah. Do you think that France and some of these European powers were involved in the death of Kwame Nkrumah?
Not so much France. France was mostly involved in coups that took place in its former colonies. We've had a total of 67 coups on the continent, and 26 countries were involved. And of the 26 countries, 16 countries were former French colonies.
Hey, I just wanted to just mention very quickly, this is it's overwhelming.
Yes, it is.
And thank you for your bravery and even speaking out.
Yes.
But one of the things that I was sitting here and I was actually going to the comments, and I guess I don't have a question as so much as a statement. The education that you're giving us, I've never really considered the Berlin Conference. I've never considered.
That's
crux of it
what
all,
set all this in motion.
Yeah, I mean, I've really never considered that, but to hear you really just give us that timeline and the parallel to what's happening here on in the United States as far as European influence, and to hear what's going on in Africa and the things that have kept the African citizens, the motherland, have kept them behind, the money, the $500 billion, to France and things like that. It's a lot, but I can listen to you all day. I should say that. But the parallel that I'm really if we read these things in history books and we talk a lot in politics about, and a lot of people don't want to hear it because they say, well, that was a long time ago. Well, look at the result of what's happening now.
So what do you want what can African Americans do to help?
I want the African Americans to understand their history, to understand that what goes on in Africa is your problem. You must understand that what goes on in Africa is your problem. You must own it. As a person of African descent, Africa is home. Africa is your anchor, and that you need to realize that until you fill that void, the average African American, if not all African Americans, whether they realize it or not, there is a void from not knowing where you come from. And that void has got to be filled in. It is a void that is very in the subconscious, deep in your subconscious. First, you must realize that void is there. African Americans and descendants of former slaves around the globe, they are the only ones who struggle with the issue of where do I come from. I had a conversation with one of my girlfriends, an African American, about 7 years ago. And I honestly can't believe that in my old age and all these years that I've lived in this country, it had never occurred to me that the issue of where do I come from is an issue. Because I've never had to ask myself that. Until one day I'm having a conversation with her and she just looked me straight in the face and says, those of you from the continent, you never have to deal with the issues that we deal with as African Americans. The simple issue of where do I come from? And for a split second, I stopped and I put myself in her position to say, I wonder what it feels like to not know where you came from. I had this overwhelming sadness and I quickly snapped myself out of it. Now, can you imagine living in that sadness of just not knowing where you come from? Can you imagine? And since then, I have been looking for it when I interact with my African American friends. I remember one time we had an event and this top executive was one of the speakers, but she spoke after me and I talked about this void and the need to reconnect. She started encountering an experience she had while just on a retreat with co-workers. And everybody was talking about where they come from. I'm German American, I'm Irish American. And as they were getting closer to her, it dawned on her that she didn't know where she came from. And she didn't know what she was going to say. And right there on the stage, she broke down. I mean, she could not stop sobbing. I had to go on the stage to hug her because she said, I didn't come here to break down. She never realized that there was this void that was so painful. But because of the environment we were in, she was able to go there. And once she got there, her feelings, she was able to express her feelings. So I want the African Americans to know that Africa is home, that what is going on in Africa is your problems and you must get involved. Until you reconnect with your anchor, which is Africa, you'll always be like a palm tree. When the wind blows this way, here we go. When the wind blows that way, here we go. Africa is home. Accept it. It is who you are. Africa is home. Accept it. It is who you are. Your DNA is the DNA of an African. Your DNA is the DNA of originality. You are the origin of humanity, and Africa is home. Reconnect. The African heads of states, they agreed on a decision this year which they called ARA 400. ARA standing for return, 400 standing for the 400 years. They declared once and for all that descendants of former slaves, Africa is their home, and that you must come home. Understand that you are welcome, and don't let anyone make you believe that your suffering was worse than those who stayed on the continent. Do you believe seriously that where they took your forefathers, they left a bed of roses? They left a land of milk and honey? The answer is no. Look at what Leopold did in the Congo. Over 75% of the population was killed. Look at what the British did to the Kikuyu. Look at what the Germans did in Namibia. The carnage continued. And to this day, actually, the carnage in Africa continues. The colonizers have never left Africa. They must get out of Africa. Whatever it takes to get the colonizers to treat Africa fairly. We are simply asking what anybody else on earth would be asking for, to be treated fairly and for them to do the right thing. To be treated fairly and for them to do the right thing.
What's next for you?
Well, I'm going to continue with the movement. I think we, people of African descent, must understand that Africa is home. But my priority is to see to it that France abolishes the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. We, the poor African countries, can no longer continue to give billions of dollars to France. That has got to stop. And if it is the last thing that I do before I die, I will stay on it until it's done.
Ambassador Chihombori Quao, we appreciate it. Thank you so very much.